Okay, so welcome back. This is the third video lecture in Human Growth and Development, Chapter 1, which is the introduction to the course, or what human growth and development is. In the second video lecture, we started talking about some of the influences on development. In this video lecture, I'm going to carry on with that topic, but also introduce some really important terms. And then the last slide, if I haven't used up my 10 minutes, is the topic is what we mean by the lifespan framework. Okay, so we left off and we were talking about the role of history and the role of culture in influencing your development. And this slide talks or introduces this notion of normative and normative versus non-normative. If you think about the term norms or normal, these refer to things that are expected or, expected and consistent, fairly universal. That's what we might call norm. Or a social norm. In this case, we're talking about normative versus non-normative. So a normative development or a normative experience is something that's common, and it's common to your culture. It's common to people of a certain age. So I added here typical or usual, as opposed to non-normative, which is like atypical or unusual. So expected or common things would be considered normative, unexpected or uncommon. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as off time, and off time is a fancy way of saying you did something at a different time than is normal. So, for example, a teenage pregnancy would be considered a non-normative event or an event that is off time, because typically in the United States, teenagers don't have children. So I believe the most common age at this point to getting married, I think the age at first marriage in the United States is like 24 for girls and 27 for men. So if you get married at 19, that would be a non-normative and off-time event by our culture. These are important concepts, partly because one of the discussion posts I ask you to think about in your lifetime, a normative event versus a non-normative event. So I was married at 21, which is below the typical time. I was pregnant before I got married, so that would be considered a non-normative off-time event. Normative age-graded event. So this is a specific kind of event that's typical. That's an event that's typical for people of your age. So examples of that would be graduating from high school at the age of 18, having grandchildren at the age of 55 or 60. A non-normative, maybe age-graded event would be you had grandchildren at the age of 30, or you graduated high school at the age of 15, right? So these are events that are not typical for people of your age. A normative history graded event, that is an event, but it's normative for that particular time in history, right? And it affects people differently depending upon where they're at in their life cycle. So this is a historical event. Would be like the pandemic of 2020. That's why I put this picture in here, because it illustrates, you remember standing in the grocery stores and all the shelves were bare, and wearing masks all the time. Like if you came of age during that, if you were graduating high school, and then the group of people that come of age at a particular historically graded event, right, and experience a non-normative history graded event, right? That's what we would call historical generation. So, for example, the group, and some of you may be part of that group that graduated high school during the pandemic, right? You didn't have a graduation, or you started college during the pandemic, or babies that were born and didn't get to see people's faces. Those are examples of a historical generation, but they experienced things. And then again, depending on how you experience the pandemic is different if you were 55 or 50 in my case versus if you were 15 and you had to do the next 2 years of school, via Zoom. I also added on here like reproductive age in a post Roe versus Wade. So an example, like for my generation, my whole reproductive career, from the time the whole time I was capable of having babies, Roe versus Wade was the law of the land, but now that law has changed. So I am of a historical generation. My mother didn't have, that wasn't part of her understanding of the world, and my daughter doesn't have. So those are not expectations um, for her reproductive considerations either. Okay, so normative, non-normative, consider a normative event. A normative event in my life would be that I graduated high school at the age of 18. I went straight away to college. After college, I went straight away to graduate school. Right, those would be normative events. So normative and off-normative. Timing. Timing is another really important part of development that you'll hear me talk a lot about. This phenomena that we call, critical versus sensitive periods. So once upon a time, there was a notion that if certain things didn't happen by a certain age, they weren't going to happen. That was what we called a critical period. And examples were that if a child didn't learn to speak by a certain, I don't remember how, before age 5, they would never learn to speak. That was the notion of a critical period. That has sort of been expanded because psychologists and developmental scientists have come to embrace this idea of plasticity. And that's what that word down here, plasticity, is. Think of it as like the brain is plastic. If you consider the way steel is compared to plastic, plastic is malleable, steel is fixed. So the assumption or the understanding now is that our brains and our neurological development is plastic, that they are malleable, and there isn't a fixed period anymore. It's not critical, but there are certain times in our development where we are more sensitive and it's easier to learn certain things, or it's easier to develop certain skills. So language is thought to have a sensitive period, that the easiest time for us to learn language is early in life. And much of the research talks about if a child is exposed to multiple languages before like the age of 5, they will be able to speak in those languages as if they are a native speaker without an accent. The older we are, we can learn languages, but we will speak with an accent, and it won't sound as if we are an authentic learner. An example of this is what I've tried to illustrate with this picture, and that's what's referred to as imprinting. I was reminded today when I was looking for these pictures that imprinting is also something that's included in the Twilight series, in the very last movie or in the very last book, where Bella's daughter, it imprints on Jacob. Right? Imprinting is a phenomena that says that the first living thing that an animal sees when they are born is who they will bond to. So these are illustrations, examples. A very famous one of this man who these ducks imprinted on him and followed him around as they were his leader, and so they learned. Right? They were learning, they were learning. And if you think about it in survival, if you were imprint on your mother, then you learn everything you need to know from your mother. So imprinting is considered to be an illustration of sensitive and critical periods, that you don't imprint at 6 months old, you imprint at birth. I'm listening to an audiobook right now about dogs, and she talks about the role of the critical period in training your puppy. And she says that the critical period for dog training is 8 weeks to 16 weeks. And that when you buy a puppy, you shouldn't buy one any older than 16 weeks, because you're going to have a hard time training them. And that within that period of time, you should expose them to all those things you want them to become familiar with. So in dogs, that critical period. And then, if any of you have ever adopted an adult dog, that once bad behaviors have been established, you can unlearn them, you can reteach them, but it is harder. And that's an example of a critical period. Okay, this is the last slide. And I want to just talk through them. I'm almost at 10 minutes, but I thought I would go ahead and talk through them. This would be what we would call the framework or the perspective, basically the 7 principles of this lifespan development model. right? Things that we assume to be true. I'm just going to read them quickly. So the first one is that development is from the time we are conceived until we are dead. It is a lifelong. Development is multi-dimensional, so this goes back to that domain. There's physical, cognitive, emotional, social. It's multi-directional. Now, I haven't really talked much about this one, but what this one says is that as we age, we become good at some things or better at some things and less good at other things. We'll talk a lot about that in the terms of cognition, because one thing that happens as we age is we're better at certain kinds of thought processes. Younger adults are better at learning new information, but older adults are better at sort of seeing the big picture, right? Same thing with that when we come to physical development, that you may develop more in like your muscle mass, but you may lose agility, things like this. The fourth one is the relative nature-nurture influence. So the idea is that what happens today will have implications for later on. There are certain things that are more influenced by her heredity very early in our development, but depending upon how the environment acts upon us, or our experiences in the environment, this will have implications for later development. Probably a better example of this one is the idea that how I take care of my body at 20 and at 30 has implications for how my body will work when I'm 50, right? So nature is very important when we're much smaller. I don't want to say that's necessarily the case, but the relative influence of those two. The fifth one, development involves changing resource allocation. And what this means is that when we are smaller, there are certain times in our development that all the energy is going to be used for like growing our body. And there are other times where it's going to be used for maybe growing our brain. If you think about that, sometimes, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of a good example, would be when we are sick, for instance. It's difficult to grow when we're trying to heal, right? So sometimes all of our energy is used to grow. Maybe, oh, I know a good example would be like the growth spurt that we see in middle school, right? When middle schoolers, they grow tall really fast and then they grow out. So we'll talk about these fancy terms called cephalocaudal and something dorsal, and it has to do with the direction that our body grows. But that's sort of what that one means, is that sometimes we're going to be growing in our brain, sometimes we're going to be growing in our body. Development shows plasticity. We are malleable creatures, right? One thing, we are always changing. And then the last one, which we also have talked about already, is that what is considered normal development and the opportunities that we're given to develop and to grow are influenced by history and culture, and time and place. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up. This is the third video lecture of chapter 1. Thank you for listening.